Hello class, in this video I'm going to go over the ground plane and we're going to render some grass in Photoshop. Now there probably are better ways of rendering a ground plane than just using the tools in Photoshop, but this lesson is about the basic tools and we'll go over those other ways in future assignments. Now the first thing to do the ground plane that we really need to do is really understand the perspective, in particular set the horizon line of the perspective. Now horizon lines is going to be important to pretty much every drawing we do in this class, and even though we're starting from a 3D model for most of the time, even in this case, you still as a renderer need to understand the basic concepts of perspective like the horizon line. Now in a drawing like this, we don't need to be 100% perfectly accurate when we're doing organic things like ground planes and what will be trees and things. So we can estimate it, and I'll go over in class the various ways you can do it, but I'm going to pick one method for here. And the way we're going to define the horizon line in this drawing is just to use guides in Photoshop. So I'm going to come up to my rulers up here. I'm going to click and hold and start pulling down. And you'll notice there's a light gray line there, and I'm going to let go about here, and it drops this cyan colored line. It gets a little lost in the sky, but that's okay. About where my horizon line is. Now I know in this case this is about right. If you didn't quite hit it, you want to adjust it, just click and hold. That's left clicking on the mouse and move it to where you want to go. Now the way I'm approximately estimating it is I'm looking at this door here, which I know is about 7 feet. And therefore I know a person is about this tall against it. But I also know that door is set up on a couple stairs. We can see the height of the stairs here. So if I think of a person is about this tall, I want to go down about the same height of those stairs. So that's going to put it approximately there. So that's going to be the edge of my ground plane, or the edge of my grass for this assignment. And as I said in the previous video, perfectly fine that your sky and your cloud goes below that line. It needs to sort of make this all work the way it wants to. We're going to use layers to take care of that, as we'll do in many cases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my layers, going to make a new layer. I'm going to call it grass. There we go. And I'm going to start by selecting a base grass color. And I'm going to pick a green, of course, but actually, as I always say, grass is actually very close to yellow in many ways than it is to green, so you can see what I'm using. Again, Photoshop, you can always adjust colors as needed at any time in the process. So I've got my foreground color set to that greenish yellow color. I'm going to go to my rectangle marquee, which is this guy right here. I'm just going to click from side to side up against that guideline. You can feel it snaps to the sides and it snaps to that guideline. And I'm going to go to Edit Fill. And under Fill, select foreground. If it doesn't default you to foreground, that's going to be this color. That's your foreground color, and hit OK. And there we go. We've got my grass plane right at the edge of the horizon line. Now that, of course, a flat green isn't quite right, and quite honestly, grass is hard to do all the way in Photoshop. And we'll even make some adjustments to this later on in later videos, but for now, we'll start here. Let's see what we can do if we add a few textures and filters and things to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Filter, and like many filters, to make them work, the first thing you need to do, you can't really work from a solid green field like this. You have to add some sort of texture. In this case, I'm going to use grain. And I apologize here because mine's not at the default settings because I've used it before. So I'm just going to pull that there. And you can see as I play with my intensity and contrast in particular, you can see the color being added. There's adding these little dots, and it's going to allow me to run other filters as needed. So we can do this, and we can say OK. And it'll render, and it's probably just rendered very slightly. If I zoom in, we can see that there is that grain there. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is I don't want this whole thing to just be all solid the same kind of green. So I want to make some areas darker, some areas lighter, and so on and so forth. So to do that, I'm going to use a great set of tools called Dodge and Burn tools. So I'll start with like the Burn tool, and I'll come up to my paintbrush size and make it rather large. And we can see when I start, I'm just clicking, I'm holding down on my left mouse button, and it's making that zone just ever so slightly darker. And I'm just going to make the foreground a little darker, the corners especially a little darker. I'm just painting it in with my mouse. Again, I have not I have had my finger on the mouse this entire time, and for the video's sake, I'm probably not going to do the nicest of jobs as I try to talk and describe at the same time. You know, I could even pick something around the building. Ultimately, I'm going to fill in the building later, so you know, if I go under the building just to give it a slightly stronger edge, that could be something that's sort of interesting. You know, something like this just going to give a little bit of depth to the grass, and I could do the opposite with my dodge tool. I need to change my brush size to make it larger, just making, you know, quick movements here so we can see if I use this, the color gets lighter. So I'll just make, I don't know, a light field over here, just down the center. So that's a bit rough right now. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go filter, and I'm going to go to blur. Actually, I'll go to blur. I'm just going to go to Gaussian blur. We can see what Gaussian blur is. It's going to blur us all together. In fact, I should have actually done this before adding the grain, so I'm going to have to go back and re-add grain into this. But we can see when I add the blur, it softens all those edges a bit. So what will hopefully happen is it looks more like hills and imperfect grass and things of that nature. So we'll say okay, just like this. And again, I apologize. Let me go back to grain and redo it here. And one thing I might do is I might actually go to my grain. I might go to enlarged or something like that. Let's try contrasty. You know, this is what I do. I just try a bunch of different things. I know I need some grain. The question is, what exact setting do I need? You know, what intensity do I need? What contrast level do I need? Those are all adjustable. So I'm going to go with this for this one, and I'm just going to say okay and reapply that grain. Just by going to that enlarged version, you can see it a little bit better that it has an effect. Now, of course, grass just doesn't still quite look like this, so I'm going to try adding one more filter to this. So I'm going to go to filter gallery, and I think what I'll do is I'll go to brush strokes, and I'm going to go to angled strokes, and we can see it starts to sort of produce, if I zoom out a little bit on here, you can see it has strokes. And so we can set our balance left or right. We can I'm going to do about halfway because that makes sense for grass, which is actually wants to be semi-vertical. Stroke length, I probably want it to be fairly long, although I might be able to turn this down a little bit. And then sharpness, you know, up to you. How strong do you want to make these strokes standing out to give this textured effect or not? Just like this, I'll go somewhere in the middle, I think, and then say okay. Now, you might experiment because some other effects in brush, like sprayed strokes, might also work. Crosshatch might also work. There might be different effects that work, but this is practice to show how to use these tools. So I'm going to say okay on the angled strokes, and we can see it's very subtle, but when I zoom in, it sort of has this sort of effect like there might be grass sort of coming up. On here, we can see there's dark areas and light areas, which again, I might go to my brightness contrast and adjust all of those things nearing the end of my assignment to sort of get those to the levels that I want to. But for now, I think this is a good base. And if I wanted to add a little more texture to this, I could do a few things. Like I could go to noise, add noise. This is going to be very, very similar to the grain that I added. It just from a different feature, we can see it's sort of making it very speckled there. Too much. I have it on Gaussian and I have it on monochrome. You can try different things to add more color in it or not. I'll keep monochrome up and I'll just pull it down just to add a little bit of noise, because the one thing about grass is it's just got lots of different colors and textures in it. That's really what makes grass look like grass. So we'll give that a try to see. Anyway, there's the grass, and we'll move on to something else in the next video.